Sean Cumming, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's been 4 years since you came on, and no pressure at all, but the first episode we did together went down an absolute dream, and I'm sure this will be no different. So welcome back to the podcast.
And thank you for the opportunity to come and talk.
No, absolute pleasure. So Sean, I know we went through your kind of background and whatnot in the first episode, like I say, was 4 years ago, but I'm sure plenty's happened since then. Would you be able to give us a bit of a brief update for anyone that doesn't know who you are?
Yeah, so I'm a professor here in Sport and Exercise Sciences in the Department for Health at the University of Bath. And my research focus is upon growth and maturation in the context of sport and exercise science. Lately, I've been doing a lot of work with various organisations such as the Lawn Tennis Association, Premier League, the FA, with regards to the subject of growth and maturity assessment in young athletes and how to manage the growth and development in young athletes, particularly as it relates to the adolescent growth spurt.
Excellent. And we've got, just you mentioned the LTA, we've got a finalist in the US Open, a teenager as well.
Yeah, she's done very well. I believe she may have been part of the cohort as well that Jill Myberg was studying for her PhD when she was collecting data on some of the top tennis players, looking at the impact of growth and maturation in tennis. So it was an interesting one because that kind of kick-started a lot of the work that we were doing. The LTA were one of the first organisations to come to us and say that, look, we think we have some selection biases as it relates to growth and maturity. And it was that work that Jill Myberg led with the LTA, which resulted in a lot of the interest from other sports such as football and gymnastics.
And football and, like you say, football and gymnastics said they had potentially had similar biases with selection. That's why you brought you in.
The biases were very stark in tennis. So tennis is a sport which demands greater size, speed, power, strength, etc. So that is naturally going to bias towards the early maturing male and early maturing female. And we found selection biases in the top 8 in every age group. And they were kicking in with the girls from the ages of about 9 to 10 years of age. And from the boys, it was around 11 to 12 years of age. These kids were not just taller and heavier, but they were more advanced in terms of their biological maturity. And of course, in a sport such as tennis, that's going to be really important. Every extra inch will give you 5% extra velocity on your serve. And if you're, say, a 12-year-old boy who is biologically 14 or 15, well, you've gone through puberty, you've got that extra muscle mass, strength and power when you're serving. So we tended to find at the top level, there was just a very high proportion of early maturers and very, very few late maturing kids surviving in the system.
And a similar story in gymnastics?
Gymnastics is a complete opposite.
Of course.
What we see with gymnastics actually is they're looking typically for the late maturing athletes. So it's almost like they want to have them as children for as long a period as possible. And then obviously when they go through the growth spurt, there's potential concerns about injury risk, for example. And of course the young gymnast has to adapt to those rapid changes in terms of both size, physique, functionality. And that can cause a lot of challenges at that point of time. And so in gymnastics, certainly since we had that big push in Eastern Europe with Eastern European programs, the selection has been very much towards the later developer. And we see similar parallels in ballet and also in diving, where they will tend to select for those late maturing individuals.
So based on that, are these organisations tapping into the data to predict who are the later maturers and selecting?
So if you go back far enough and look at the Eastern European systems, they were screening the athletes at a very early age. And so, you're talking about them sitting down with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And it's quite difficult at that point of time to tell who's early on time or late because they're all children at that point. But one of the things that they did look at was the mothers. So we know there's a big, strong genetic component to maturity timing. So if mother was a late developer, there's a good likelihood that the daughter is going to be a late developer. So one of the questions they would ask is age at menarche. And so it's the age at which individuals had their first menstrual cycle start. And so the average age, I think in the UK, it's about 12.6 to 12.8 years in girls. So if you had a mother who maybe did not hit menarche until 15 or 16 or so, which is within the normal ranges at the extreme end, but it is still normal, then it's likely that their daughters will probably also be later developers too. So that was definitely part of the screening process, a very holistic screening process that they were using in Eastern Europe at that point of time.
Mm-hmm. Just to give us a bit of a jumping off point here, Sean, I know that there's going to be, we've predicted an hour, but
Yeah.
I bet we could go for 5 hours talking about this stuff. But
It's a fun subject.
yeah, absolutely. And diverse, as we were talking about before, and
Yes.
linking all this to the animal kingdom, which we may throw in there as well if we're lucky. So considering biological maturation versus chronological age,
Yes.
why should coaches care?
Okay. Well, if you think about the way we organise youth sports, we typically group children by their chronological ages. So we have age groups for competition, we have age groups for training, and even if we're evaluating kids from, say, a talent ID perspective, we'll be using age groups. Now, in most academies, that's a 1-year band, but in some sports, for example, in French rugby, you have a 2-year band. Now, the age group system actually makes a lot of sense. If we want to group kids on attributes that closely follow age, such as cognitive development, experience playing sports, motor skill development, social development, those things are all quite closely tied and associated with age. So age groups is a great way of matching kids in those elements. What doesn't tie in with age perfectly is biological development, and within a particular age group we can get huge disparity in terms of the biological ages of the children. Mandy Johnson showed this when she was working at Manchester United. She would have 9-year-olds, some of whom were biologically 12 and a half, and some 9-year-olds in exactly the same age group who were like 6 to 7 years of age biologically. So you're talking about 5 to 6 years difference. And of course, if you're going to be evaluating a player, then that has a big impact. If you're going to be presenting kids for equitable competition, particularly during adolescence, where that early developer may be close to being fully mature, and that late developer still hasn't even hit the pubertal growth spurt, that's going to have huge implications beyond technical or tactical ability often. And in addition, if we think about this from a training perspective, and I highly encourage people to take a look at a lot of the work that Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver have done in this area. If we're going to be training athletes, we want to make sure that the training stimulus, the training content match the underlying physiological changes that are occurring in the child at that point of time to maximise effectiveness of our training, but also to ensure safety. And the safety is a really important factor, because we know certainly with the growth spurt we see this big spike in terms of stress-related injuries, severs, Osgood-Schlatters, these types of injuries kicking in. And they tend to follow a distal to proximal gradient, whereas the legs grow first in children and then the torso, for example. So it's not surprising we see severs kick in around 85% of adult height, Osgood-Schlatters around 90 to 91, right at that peak of that growth spurt, whereas your lower back stuff, your spondylosis, etc., is more likely to present at the end of the growth spurt, because different parts of the body are growing at different times. So your growth spurt occurs in your feet before it's in the lower legs, before it's in the torso. So one of the biggest successes I think we've had so far in football is the clubs, with the systems we set up now, can better recognise when those kids are going through those spurts and adjust the training programmes accordingly to reduce things such as injuries or adolescent awkwardness coming through, thus safeguarding the children. And of course, if you just throw the kids into the age groups and provide them a training programme based upon their age, well, some kids it'll be fine, it'll be the appropriate program, but for the early developer it might not be pushing them hard enough. Late developer might be too much at that point of time. So it's about taking individual variation into consideration.
You mentioned, was it French rugby, the example of the 2-year ban?
Yes.
Is there any thought behind that?
I think
Is there
it's
any benefit, or?
to some extent. I think
Okay.
it's, a game such as rugby, you've got to have 15 players, and then you're probably going to have bench players as well. And so that's quite a lot of ask. And to get that all from one age group might be challenging if you're living in, say, a rural community. Like I grew up in the Orkney Islands, and our age groups for football covered about 3 years because, we're coming from a wee village of about 2,000 folk. And so the age range would be quite wide, and of course the maturity range was gargantuan in some of those age groups. Now, when we looked at we've just done a paper actually with the chaps down in the south of France, in Toulouse, and they looked at the French academy system, or the French junior rugby programs, and they were looking at actually a weight grading system similar to what they have in New Zealand, to see if that might be a better way of reducing the huge variation in size within the age groups. And it was quite effective. It was dropping the variation by about 50% in most instances, and the variation was absolutely huge. I went back actually just last month, I was looking at that data. The difference between the smallest kid and the tallest kid, or the biggest kid, within those 2-year age bands, the bigger kid was over 3 times heavier than the smallest kid.
Three times.
3 times, over 3 times heavier.
Wow,
In football, I've seen over twice
yeah.
the size, and you get that. But when you open it up to 2-year band, if you got an oldest kid who was also an early developer and the youngest kid who's also a late developer, then yeah, you're going to get chalk and cheese there. You're going to get very different sizes in terms of the kids. And if you think about that in terms of competitive equity and potential safety as well, there are concerns there.
So when you mention about differentiations on training programs based on the rate of growth and maturation of these youth athletes, is there any kind of core recommendations that you give or would advise to coaches to kind of create a framework for the alterations based on early maturers and late maturers?
Yeah. Well, the first
for
one,
safety in
So the first one is setting up systems of measurement and making sure that you're aware and you're regularly assessing the athlete. So it's not that the athlete suddenly goes into the growth spurt, gets injured, and you're like, oh crap, they're in the growth spurt. You're predicting to it. Now, this is one of the best benefits, I think, of working with the Premier League. We started with education to begin with. So we had pretty much practitioners, so it's usually sports scientists and sports medical staff, physios from the clubs, coming and getting educated on growth and maturation, how to assess it. One of the things we flagged up to them in these workshops was that this was a period of time where you get the severs, the Osgood-Schlatters, the severs, the spondylosis, the stress fractures tending to present, and to be very aware of it. And of course, as part of the work that we did with the Premier League, we also set up a growth and maturation module within the PMA, which would allow the clubs to track and measure the kids. Now, one of the things that occurred after we'd done that and implemented the system was that some of the clubs independently started coming back to us afterwards saying, this is a really useful system because now we can count down to when the kids are going into the growth spurt. And what they were doing is they were looking for red flags. Are you in the growth spurt? What is your current rate of growth? Is it above 7 centimetres, more than we would normally see in childhood? Were the kids showing any signs of adolescent awkwardness? Were the physios flagging up any symptomology? Was their training load particularly high at this point of time? And if they were seeing these red flags, then they would start adjusting the training programs for the kids. And the clubs were coming back to us and saying, look, we think we're starting to get reductions in terms of injuries. This year, we haven't had any examples of, say, Osgood-Schlatters this year, when previously, we had about 4 or 5 kids with it. And we think this is working. Now, I was presenting that at the conference in Singapore, and there was a chap there called Jan Willem Tunissen. He used to be the movement scientist at Ajax. He's one of the authors of the athletic skills model. And me and Jan were having breakfast the next day, and he says, Sean, we were doing this ages ago in Ajax. He says, we were doing this 10 years ago, this biobanding stuff. And he goes, oh, please tell me more about it. And he said, we had these 3 phases for the athletes in the academy. Phase 1 was what they would refer to as monkey see, monkey do. The kids are going through childhood. There's nothing disruptive in terms of growth. They're really quick at picking up skills and having fun. But all of a sudden you get to this point where they notice the growth spurt kicked in, and some of the kids started to struggle at that point of time. They tended to pick up injuries. You might get regressions in performance. And so what they did was, with those kids who moved into that zone, they would change about 50% of their training program. They would reduce the load, the number of games that they were playing in, but it wasn't that they stopped training. They would substitute that training with training which was more developmentally appropriate for them. So a lot of the focus was on lower body strength, core strength, balance, coordination, a lot of stuff on disruption of skills, where they would put them on crash mats and would be doing ball juggling, for example, on crash mats. They would have tension lines out. They'd be doing balancing on the tension lines. They would be put into certain positions where they had to hold a pose, and the other kid would be pushing them along the floor, and they were having to use their core strength to hold that position and that mobility at that point of time. And the great thing with Jan Willem is he did it in such a fun manner. So it's a lot of small games. A lot of the games were in sock feet. They took the shoes off so they couldn't do high intensity, and of course, shoes off, it focuses you to work a little bit more on your balance and coordination. And so I said, well, was it effective? And he says, yeah. He says, nobody got injured. He says, in addition, the kids transitioned much, much more effectively at that point of time. And, while we thought they might hate having this and not getting the opportunity to play football, they actually turned up 20 minutes early for the sessions because they enjoyed them so much, because Jan was so creative in terms of the way that he worked things. So we were really interested in this because this was somewhat similar to what had been going on with some of the clubs independently in the Premier League. And David Johnson, who had started with me as a PhD student, at AFC Bournemouth was particularly interested in this because he had noticed in his first study that there was this big spike in injuries as the kids went through the growth spurt. So we actually implemented Jan's program over at Bournemouth last season, and what we did is for those kids who were above that 7.2 centimetre growth spurt, and those kids who were in 88 to 94% of adult stature, so smack in the middle of the growth spurt, they had 90 minutes worth of their program adjusted. So again, a reduction in load, working out in bare feet, reducing accelerations and decelerations, which might put stress on the joints at that point of time. But then again, key things, fundamental movement skills, core strength, mobility, coordination. And we went back at the end of the season and took a look at the data. Now, the groups which had not had their training programs changed, the pre-growth spurt and the post-growth spurt groups, the injury incidence, the injury burden was exactly the same. But when we looked at the group in the middle where David and Ben Bradley had done their intervention, there was a 70% drop in terms of the injury incidence.
70?
70%. It was incredible that it completely dipped. It went in the opposite direction of where we previously had this spike. We had this dip. These kids were just not getting injured. And then when we looked at the injury burden, it dropped from about 130 days per 1,000 hours exposure to just over 1 day. So it was absolutely mad. But then again, if you think about it, the system they had at Ajax, they put in place for a long period of time, and developmentally it makes sense to do that. And, not every athlete is going to get injured as they go through the growth spurt, but for a lot of those athletes who might be at risk, it could be quite a good thing. So it's been exciting, and we're starting to look at seeing now, can we also apply this in tennis? Because a lot of kids in tennis would naturally get injured as they start to go through the growth spurt, and of course gymnastics is a classic one for it. And you keep in mind as well that those gymnasts are late developers. They're going through the growth spurt maybe 15, 16 years of age. 15, 16 year age, you're training a hell of a lot in gymnastics. So it's about, okay, yeah, you have to train, but can we train in maybe some slightly more developmentally sensitive manner to, pick up those kind of potential risk factors and better keep the athletes through that point of time. And of course, there's some really good research as well just come out from Denmark, from Sinead Holden, that shows that those athletes who do pick up these Osgood-Schlatter type injuries, those growth-related injuries during puberty, is not that they just have this injury and that's it over and that's it all over with, etc. These things tend to follow through post-growth spurt and tend to be problematic, so they're nursing these injuries for quite some period of time. So, yeah, if we can stop that, clear benefit, not just for the coaches and the programs, but for the athletes as well.
And Ajax haven't done bad, have they? Churning out players from
no
their youth system.
This is a great thing. I would highly encourage you to get Jan Willem on as a guest because, Jan Willem has all the videos of everything that they were doing and those types of activities. And in these videos, you'll see the likes of Matthijs de Ligt, Danny van der Beek, all those guys going through these types of programs. And it's quite interesting seeing some of those players as they go through the growth spurt. They do look quite awkward. I remember him saying that one of the players who's eventually been sold for a large amount of money, you would not have invested them in when you saw them in the middle of the growth spurt because you get these dips in performance. And in fact, Megan Hill, who did her PhD with Southampton and has just graduated, she was working very closely with Sam Scott there. They looked over 5 years worth of data and she found that as the kids go through the growth spurt, the match grades do go down. And then they come back up afterwards. So if you're using match grades to decide whether or not you're going to be contracting a player, it's not just whether they're early on time or late, it's are they in the middle of the growth spurt, because you don't want to pull the trigger on a kid because you really haven't got a clue what you're going to see at that point of time.
Mm-hmm. So just remind me of the growth rate that would flag.
Yeah, so in childhood, the growth rate is usually about 5 to 6 centimetres, and it's really quite steady. You'll get little bumps here and there. So 5 per year, so 5 to 6 centimetres per year. And then when you look at the growth spurt, you're going to tend to find that anywhere above 7.2 centimetres appears to be one of the sort of key sort of criteria where injury risk tends to ramp up. Now, at the peak of the growth spurt, you're usually looking at about 12, 13 centimetres per year. But in some kids, because the growth spurt's an interesting one, growth is saltatory, so you get this rapid growth and slow down, rapid growth and slow down. So if you measured it regularly enough, you see this massive big spike. But of course, if you smooth it out, you see this lovely little curve. And some of those spikes, we see players up to 20 to 22 centimetres per year at the rapid period of their growth. And of course, there's players such as, Scott McTominay at Manchester United who had an incredible growth spurt. I think some of the stats you maybe read about it in the newspapers are maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's no doubt, talking to James Parr, who did his PhD with me up at Man United on growth and maturation, there's no doubt that some of these athletes will have very kind of rapid growth spurts as they go through those processes.
So was he a late maturer, Scott?
Yes, he was a late developer.
Okay.
Interesting chatting with James about this, because it was kind of just after that kind of growth spurt where people really started paying attention to him and starting to see, this player really has got it. And of course, you also see that with examples from the Belgian Futures program as well. So, likes of Kevin De Bruyne. There's a really nice article talking about the Futures program where they had a chap who was working, it's Eric Abrams, who worked with the Futures program, and he says the likes of De Bruyne, Mertens, Courtois, all talented boys, very capable, but you really didn't see the full potential of them until they came through that growth spurt. Because, technically, tactically fantastic, but the physical disadvantages of being a late developer means that often you don't see them really full potential. But of course, once they've gone through that and the physical differences are taken away, that's when the technical tactical really comes to shine through. And that's why some of the late developers are slow burners.
Would you say the recommendations that you've mentioned about the using football as an example would be similar in gymnastics and tennis? And by that I mean the reductions in overall load, like would the fundamentals be very similar, no matter what the sport, or would there be certain nuances within each sport that you would
I think all those athletes are going to experience the same thing in terms of the growth changes that are going to be occurring during that point of time. So they're all going to change rapidly in terms of the physique, change in terms of strength, speed, power, etc. But I guess the differences would be that different sports, they're probably going to be experiencing it at different ages. As I said, the gymnasts and particularly the ballet dancers, they are going to experience it relatively late on in their careers. Misty Copeland, who's one of the prima ballerinas in New York, she didn't hit her growth spurt until about 17, 18 years of age. She was training 30 hours a week at that point of time. She came down with 6 stress fractures at that point. So obviously much bigger implications if you're hitting it with an incredibly high load. If you're an early developer, well, you might hit your growth spurt in ballet at the age of 10 or 11, and you may be training 10 hours a week, so it's maybe slightly less of an issue. Tennis was an interesting one, because I did a session with the mums and dads of the top 8 in every age group with the LTA, and a consistent message we were getting back from them was that kids are picking up injuries as they go through the growth spurt. But there's almost this pressure that I think that the mums and dads and the kids feel is to keep up their rankings and, to make sure they get into the right competitions. You've got to train hard. You've got to compete through that period of time. But in order to do that, you have to put in the shift and the effort, and that load is naturally going to be quite high. And if the athletes are picking up injuries at that point of time, well, we know that injuries predict future injuries. As with Sinead Holdensworth in Denmark, those injuries are going to nag and follow through into early adulthood as well. And so it would almost be of benefit, I think, there to say, okay, keep training through the growth spurt, but train smarter through the growth spurt. Yes, have some competitions, but maybe not excessive amounts of competitions. Be willing to allow your maybe grade to dip, or your ranking to dip a little bit about that point of time. But make sure you get the athlete through that period of time as healthy as possible, so that when they're through that, yes, you can ramp up the training, etc. And at that point of time, they should be able to go on and be successful afterwards. And you've got to keep in mind as well, the majority of young athletes are not going to be professionals, so it's really imperative for us to keep them safe and healthy.
When we're comparing early and late maturers, how long does it take an early maturer to actually catch up, not only physically, but mentally as well?
So the mental one's an interesting one. We'll start with the physical one first, though. So if we're talking about the boys and the girls are going to be the first ones to go through the growth spurt. The boys are usually about a couple of years in delay in terms of going through the growth spurt. An early maturing boy could be physically mature at the ages of 15 or 16. A late maturing boy, it might not be until 21, 22 that they are fully physically mature. And of course, if we're looking at brain development, that's going to go on for even slightly longer than that. And so it's going to take quite a bit of time for them to catch up. I remember chatting with a fellow who was He's actually one of the UK's top hurdlers, and it was Malcolm Arnold, who was his coach up at Team Bath, and we had a placement student working with Malcolm, and I went out, did my placement visit, checking up on the student, and I was just sitting down having a chat with Malcolm, and of course Malcolm's just a legend in track and field, and I was really interested in asking him about hurdling and late developers, because you'd assume a late developer with longer legs, shorter torso, more linear frame might be more appropriate in that sport. And so I asked him specifically about that, and he was giving me some insight. And then one of his athletes rolled up, and he goes, "Oh yeah, this guy will give you some good insight into it." And he says, I wasn't physically fully mature until the age of about 21, that I actually stopped growing. And he just recently come back from an indoor competition, and he'd come about second or third in this big European indoor competition. But he says, coming back, even though I didn't win, I really felt good about the competition because I'm still pretty light in terms of my physicality. I haven't really put on the lean muscle mass yet. These guys I was competing against, they were physically mature at 17 or 18. They've really bulked up at that point of time. So if you think about it in terms of how much time I've got left to benefit, post being mature in terms of bulking up in size, I know that if I'm only just losing them just now, as soon as I address that physicality, I'm going to be kicking their butts later on. So it's an interesting one. So there can be quite a bit of variance there. Now, with regards to the cognitive maturity and the cognitive development, that is much, much more likely to follow age and experience. And so those are going to be the key factors in determining whether an individual's advanced in those areas. The one aspect of psychology which does follow biological maturation, however, is the emotional changes that occur during puberty. So this is one of the reasons why early maturing boys and early maturing girls are potentially more of a challenge as they go through puberty, is because they experience this at a much earlier age. So the changes that occur in terms of drives during puberty, kids become less playful, they become more interested in peer groups, social awareness, social sensitivity, social reinforcement, and risk-taking, all that kind of stuff that occurs during puberty. That kicks in very early for an early maturer. For the girls it might be 10 or 11, for the boys it might be, say, 12 or 13. Now, keep in mind that they are still 10-year-olds and 13-year-olds at that point of time. From a cognitive perspective, in terms of cognitive development, they're not that advanced, so they're not that bright. They don't have those skills yet to regulate those emotions very effectively. Now, a late maturing individual, they might experience that at 15 or 16. They're older, they're wiser, they've seen the peer groups go through it before. And it's really not that surprising that when we look at all the health risk behaviour, smoking, drinking, sex at early ages, for example, it's a big cluster of risk behaviours there for the early maturers. Particularly for the girls, we see all those kind of risk behaviours there. And it makes sense biologically because they're experiencing those urges and pressures at a much earlier age when they lack the cognitive skills to be able to cope with it. And we have to keep in mind as well is that society plays a role as well, because society is going to look at those individuals and go, they're adult, they're more mature, for example, they'll treat them, they'll reinforce them and interact with them in a more mature way. So it's, and those types of kids are going to want to hang out with more older, mature people who are naturally going to be engaging in more smoking or drinking or whatever. So it's a little bit of combination of the biology and the socio-cultural things kind of coming together there. But fascinating stuff. And I've done some of my work and research in the area of exercise is kind of picked up on those kind of areas and the social pressures and the psychology behind it. But yeah, it's a fascinating area.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk about fascinating areas. It's a little bit of a segue into what we were talking about before. And I suppose the breadth of the impact of this type of research and the interest that it generates in not only humans, but in the animal kingdom as well. And I don't want to replicate our short conversation beforehand, but I found it fascinating and probably eye-opening to understand where you are in terms of your interests in this area. Would you be able to give us a bit of an insight into that?
Yeah, so the area of growth and maturation is a fascinating one because I really didn't do that much on the subject matter until my PhD. I'd done my undergraduate in psychology at Edinburgh, and we had a lot of emphasis upon child development there, and I found that area fascinating, but it was largely focused upon emotional, social, cognitive development, and some motor development as well, a lot of stuff in ecological sort of dynamical systems. And it was when I went to Exeter to do my master's with Stuart Biddle that Stuart had done a lot of work on paediatric populations, and I was very interested in the motivation sides of things. But it wasn't until I went to Michigan State when I was working with Bob Molina that I was really introduced to the subject. And of course, everybody grows and everybody matures, so we all have our own stories we can tell about the subject matter. And we all have our stories about adolescence and the things that we did. And, they're quite embarrassing, many of them as well. We really didn't understand what the hell was going on at that point of time. But when you actually study the science, it clarifies everything so clearly, which is nice. So Bob Molina, who I worked with in the States, and I still continue to work very closely with Bob, he's a good friend and colleague. He was just one of those academics who can talk about anything and everything. He was just fascinated in the subject of growth and maturation, whether it be in the animal species, whether it be related to exercise or related to exercise behaviours or drinking or smoking or thriving, the effect of pollution, etc. He was just interested in the subject matter. And I think it's important to read outside of your area too, because it then gives you interest in terms of, or insight in terms of how you might better understand growth and maturity and exercise. So when I first started doing it, pretty much everybody who studied growth and maturity was a physiologist or had a background in S&C. So it was lots and lots of really great research, but all from a bio perspective, showing early maturers bigger, stronger, faster. Nobody had really looked at the psychosocial elements of it. And Bob impressed upon me, he says, look, most of the psychologists tend to be a little bit biophobic. Most of the biologists don't understand psychology. There's a gap in the market there for you. If you come into the context of sport and exercise and start looking at the interactions between growth, maturation, and psychology and social behaviour, you can do some science. It'll be unique and it'll be innovative. And, I always wanted to do things that other people aren't doing. I wouldn't want to spend my life just testing somebody else's theory of motivation or something like that. I want to try and do something that would be new and fun and innovative, and it might not be the best, but it's new, and that's kind of what excites me. And Bob pointed me to go and take a look at developmental psychology and animal psychology to understand growth and maturation in those contexts, because there was a lot of fantastic work being done in that area. The other thing that's probably given me that interest in animals is that my brother is he trained as a marine biologist. He manages salmon farms in the Shetlands for a large Norwegian company. And every time I chat with him, he's very well read in terms of animal science. And every time I chat with him, he always pulls something out from the animal kingdom. So I was talking to him about the work I was doing with Siobhan Mitchell with the ballet dancers, and talking about how, ballet selects for late maturers. And he goes, yeah, it's the same thing in salmon farming. And I goes, oh, come on. And he goes, yeah, it's not just that late maturers that we go for. We want late maturers that also grow rapidly. And I goes, okay, well, what's this all about? And he goes, well, think about it. He says, as a salmon farmer, you want to maximize the profit on your product. So you want a big fish. Okay, so you want the thing to grow rapidly. But you don't want it to grow fast. Because as soon as the salmon hits its maturity, it invests all of its effort and energy into becoming reproductive. It gets this massive jaw that sticks out like so. All the colour tends to go from the flesh out to the skin, etc. And he says, if we have salmon that hit maturity, we kind of sell them for nothing but cat food. Because the things just don't look nice, and the quality of the flesh is poor as well. So what we do in terms of our selective breeding for salmon is we go for salmon that grow very, very fast, but also mature very, very late. So what they're looking for is the biggest possible fish before they actually harvest it. So, of course, they're tracking and monitoring those fish, and they're getting the biggest fish possible. And just before they're about to hit puberty, boom, that's when they harvest them, so they can maximize their profit. So you see all these little examples out there on different animals and how they grow and they mature at different effects. And I've been reading more stuff as well about how fish maturity in terms of whether they're early, late, or lifespans are also influenced by fishing patterns as well. So if you overfish a certain species, then you'll tend to find that there is a shift towards earlier maturation to try and replenish that species, which appears to occur naturally within the environment. Really, really fascinating stuff. And of course, the size of the nets has an issue too, because if you have a European law that says that, you got to have big kind of gill nets, then all the big fish get caught, who tend to be the late maturers. And the fish that survive are the early maturers, who are small in nature. And so it's just fascinating stuff. I could read about the subject for ages.
Super interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. It's definitely gives a bit of breadth to the conversations
Yeah.
and depth, obviously, but that's class. So monitoring maturation, you mentioned it right at the start. Pros and cons of the various methods that we can use out there, potentially for people who are listening who have got a lot of budget, which isn't to very many people, but the majority who've got a very limited budget. What options have we got and the pros and cons?
Okay, so we start with the if you've got the budget. So the most probably objective method for assessing maturity in youth is skeletal age. So with skeletal age, you'll be taking a hand wrist X-ray of the child, and you can use a number of protocols. There's the Fell's protocol, Grudlich-Pyle. There's 3 versions of the Tanner-Whitehouse method, and you can use that to get an estimate of skeletal age from the child. It's complex. It requires trained individuals. It's expensive. It also involves an exposure towards radiation, and I guess the concern with radiation is that if you're going to be exposing a child to radiation, there needs to be a good medical rationale to do so. So most clubs will only do that when there's a concern with regards to maybe they haven't got a clue what age the child is. Maybe the child is from a country where they don't collect age, and it's really important that they know where the child is to understand their development and for the child's safety. Or it might be an instance where a child has suddenly got an injury and they think they might be in the middle of the growth spurt, and we might do an assessment there. So in the United Kingdom, typically we don't find most people using X-rays unless they are certain particular situations. The amount of radiation actually is quite small. You're talking about the equivalent of being outside for about 3 hours. You got a lot more taking the team over to play a game in Portugal, for example, and then flying on a plane. But you have to obviously think about it from a medical rationale in terms of the benefit of the child. Other methods that are starting to be looked at is looking at ultrasound. Now, there were methods that did look at ultrasound, which have been largely kind of poo-pooed. And the major reason being is that you would typically focus only upon the radius and the ulna. And of course, those are probably 2 of the most variable bones to study in the hand and the wrist. And so the reliability of these methods is not particularly high. There is, however, new methods coming out where they're looking at multiple sites, and from some of the early work we're doing in there, they do appear to be a lot more reliable when you're looking at not just the radius and ulna, but the carpals and the phalanges, so you get multiple sites and a little bit more confidence. But still a lot of work to be done in that area. But the nice thing about those methods is that they don't have the radiation. But obviously we'll have to wait and see in terms of the reliability and validity of those. If you're not taking those types of methods, the most common other methods would be the somatic maturity indicators. So when we started work with the Premier League, the most common one which was being used was the Meerwald offset method, which looks at predicting the age at which children hit peak height velocity. And so the average age is 13.8 years in boys. It's about 12.1 in girls. And so a kid who hits it at 15 would be a late developer. A kid who hits it at 10 would be an early developer. And it gives you an idea in terms of counting down towards when peak height velocity is going to occur, which is the top of the growth spurt. But it also tells you whether a player's in the middle of the growth spurt or beyond it. Now, while that was a popular method and it's quite easy to implement, Bob Molina's done a number of studies now where he's actually taken longitudinal data. And he's looked at the accuracy of the method. And the problem is that there is error that changes with age. So if you have lots of young kids, it will overpredict them as early maturers. If you have lots of older kids, it will underpredict them, and therefore they'll all be identified as late maturers. Now, the big issue is that those errors are magnified quite largely in the early and late developers. So sometimes you might be off in your prediction by 1 to 2 years, which is problematic if you're looking to adjust a training program relative to the kid being in the growth spurt. And it's been a bit of a hot potato debate between the various scientists involved with the programs now. And all methods have their limitations, but you just need to be very careful if you're using that one. And I think that's perhaps maybe one of the reasons why a lot of the clubs have now shifted and moved towards the percentage of predicted adult stature method, which requires the height measurements, the weight measurements, but the biological parent heights. And the error for that is 2.2 centimeters in boys, which is about 1.5 of percentage of predicted adult height either way, and about 1.7 centimeters in girls. And so the idea here is that if you have 2 boys, say for example, and we know their predicted adult height, we can express their current height as a percentage of that predicted. adult height, and so we can tell how close they are to being fully mature, or how delayed they are in terms of the maturity. And the
And
nice
what's
thing
that
about
called?
this,
What method's that called? Just so people
it's,
can
well,
look
so
at.
the method for the height prediction is called the Kamish-Roche
Yeah.
method for height prediction, but the actual protocol, which involves all the different steps, was developed by Bob Molina at Michigan State University. In fact, I was doing my PhD with him. I think it was the first time we ever implemented that whole protocol was during the PhD, and we were looking at it in a combination of both American football players and soccer players at that point of time. Now, that method, as I said, it does have its error, but we've been looking at data from Bournemouth, and it doesn't appear to have an accentuated error in early on time or late maturing kids. So there's not the concerns about the big over exaggerations of the errors with this method. The ideal situation, though, is that you have a method in there, but you're not just looking at the percentage of adult stature. You're also collecting repeated data in terms of heights and weights, so you can plot the growth velocity. And it's also eyeballing a kid as well. If you don't know and understand growth and maturity, and that growth occurs first in the feet and then the lower legs and then the upper body and broadening of the shoulders, lean mass, you can pretty much eyeball a kid and get a pretty good idea of exactly where they are. So the more information you can gather on the child, definitely the better.
How does that change with different backgrounds, ethnicities?
Yep, great question. Now, this has been an interesting one, because if we look at racial differences, there are racial differences, but you got to keep in mind is that there is more variation within the races than there is between the races.
Okay, right.
So I remember chatting with Mandy Johnson with her kids up there at United, and she was saying from all the x-rays she had done, and that's not just United, that's lots of different clubs and organisations she was working with, she tended to find that the African Caribbean boys were usually about a year in advance of the white boys in terms of their skeletal maturity. And there is some evidence to support that in, just general population as well, that there may be these racial differences, but again, more variation within the races than between. So, for example, she said, that Danny Welbeck, for example, at United was a very late developer, as was Jesse Lingard up at United, very, very late developer. And huge variation within. On average, you're typically going to be finding that your African kids are probably more likely to be slightly in advance. Your Hispanic kids, kids from say southern parts of Spain, Portugal, be slightly more advanced in terms of your northern Europeans. With Asians as well, they tend to be slightly in advance of whites as well, but not huge differences. Probably the biggest factor of anything is probably environment rather than genetics. So a really good example of this comes from South Africa, from some of Noel Cameron's work. Noel Cameron's an esteemed professor up at Loughborough who's done one of the leading researchers in growth and maturity in the United Kingdom. And he was studying black boys growing up and black girls growing up in some of the townships in South Africa. This was really fascinating because in that instance with the boys, he found that the black boys in South Africa were actually maturing in delay of the white boys, which is the opposite of what we would see up here in the United Kingdom. But again, a lot of that was probably down to thriving and sustenance, getting a lack of nutrition, growing up in a poor environment, etc., is going to delay your maturation. The girls were the same in terms of the white girls and the black girls, suggesting that when it comes to the sex, women are definitely the hardier sex in terms of being less likely to have their genetic profile or genetic blueprint being influenced by environmental factors. And again, that goes with, if you look at a lot of sort of epigenetic type of stuff, I think mutations are much, much more likely to be occurring in males than they are in females, and we're much, much more susceptible to environmental factors. There's also some really good stuff looking at kids growing at altitude in poor areas in South America, where you've got these kids and they've all of a sudden moved to Florida, and they're in Florida in an environment where it's nice and warm, it's not at altitude, and within a couple of generations they've caught up in terms of maturation, in terms of them maturing at the same rate as other kids. So race and ethnicity does have an impact, but probably not as big as an impact as a lot of people would like to think.
One thing we talked about last time we spoke 4 or 5 years ago was biobanding, and that was something that you mentioned right at the start. Has that progressed in terms of the uptake it's had? From a football example was what we used before, so we'll use that again. Has that become more prevalent in football academies with people using biobanding, or is it still the the Southamptons and the Bournemouths that seem to be on board.
There's still certain clubs who have who really sort of prioritise it, but we definitely had many more clubs who've started looking at it and experimenting with it. I think there's probably about 20 plus clubs I've spoken to across the various leagues in England and Scotland who have started experimenting with the biobanding. And what's been really nice is that they're advancing the approaches that they're taking. You know, when we first started off, we hadn't a blinking clue what on earth was going to happen. We didn't know whether it would be useful or not, but we started to find out that there appeared to be some benefits. And other researchers such as Chris Towson up at Hull, Will Abbott down at Bournemouth, Ben Bradley down at Bournemouth, also Will Abbott down at Brighton, Ben Bradley have started looking into this, and there's also Michael Roman down at Switzerland. And what's fascinating is we're starting to get different independent groups looking at it, using different methods, different technologies, but it seems to be coming through with a consistent message that this is really challenging the early developers by giving more opportunity for the late developers, and just almost like flipping the age group system on its head, that all of a sudden those early developers are getting pushed and late developers are getting a slightly different challenge as well. But what's been great, as I said, is that some of those clubs are really starting to take the practice to the next level. So if we look at Southampton, they were relying their psychology support. Amy down at Southampton, Amy Price, does individual workshops for the early developers and the late developers. So with the early developers, they're going to go up playing against older, smarter boys, less time on the ball. They're going to be struggling and failing. So they're all taught about how to deal with that, because you can't just throw them into it and hope that they get out with it, which we did in the first place. If you can prepare them for that challenge, it makes it a lot easier. In addition, if you look at the late developers, they're expected to take on the role of leading, communicating, organising, mentoring, etc. They've been borrowing heavily from a lot of work by Vygotsky, looking at mixed age classrooms in terms of how to benefit the older and the younger kids, which is basically what biobanding is to some extent. You've got some older and some younger kids, but they're all of a similar physical development, and using those kind of systems to better optimize the effectiveness of the biobanding. And I was chatting with Des Ryan recently about some of the things he was looking to implement at Arsenal before he left. And of course, they've got some great folk down there, Poddy Roche, Perry Stewart, for example, who are incredibly switched on to the growth and maturity. And they were taking a very systematic approach to it in terms of gathering everybody around, identifying strengths and weaknesses for each player before they biobanded them, discussing who should be in which particular bands, identifying a particular goal, whether it be physical, psychosocial, technical, etc., for that biobanded phase. Work with the kids for a week in advance, structure the programs to help them work on those elements they're meant to be tested on in the biobanding. Then you have your tournament and you evaluate afterwards. And this is great, because you've got some incredibly switched on practitioners there who, are thinking about things I would never think about at all. And it makes sense because, I'm not developing athletes at all. I'm not working at the coalface with these folk. They understand the athletes and the systems much, much more effectively and how to implement these systems more effectively. I just kind of have some fun in terms of getting along to work alongside them and pick up and learn and maybe give them some advice here and there in terms of how to do things. But it's been really incredible to see how much the clubs have advanced the kind of concept to make it much more effective and efficient going forward.
So would it be that regular monitoring that is helping these practitioners understand which band the players go in, and how are they deciding how late an athlete goes into the early, and then vice versa? How are they making the cut points is what I'm saying.
So in terms of the cut points we've been going with 5% bands normally. So that was kind of just a band which we felt was about half of the variance of what we would see in normal age group competitions. But it also fit quite neatly in terms of we could say 80 to 85. Well, these are the kids who are all kind of pre-pubertal. They haven't kicked off in the growth spurt yet. We then have a group of kids 85 to 90. Those are kids just starting to go in the growth spurt. So they are stretching, getting a little bit awkward, but nobody looks like, nobody's muscle bound at that point of time. Nobody's had their sort of peak weight velocity kick in. I remember watching Arsenal Southampton in a biobanded game. We had the 85 to 90s on one field, and then you look over to the other field, it was the 90 to 95s. And of course, the 90 to 95s those were big kids. These
Yeah.
were looked like young men. And the difference between those kids and these kids over here was just like night and day. And of course, if you think about, Paudie's down there in charge of the strength and conditioning programs at Arsenal, those kids were fit. Those kids were very, very strong. And of course, kids at different ages, etc. But it was a very much different game, played at a much higher pace with more physicality once you get to the 90 to 95s. But when it comes down to it, you can put a kid in a band, but you should consider the kid holistically in terms of, okay, well, do they have the confidence to go up yet? Do they have an emotional maturity to be able to play at that level, or the technical capacity? So I remember one of the games we had with, it was one of the coaches at Villa. They had a kid who was just on that 90 to 95 band. I think he was like 90.2 or something like that. And the coach saw him and he said within the first minute, you could tell the kid was depth. So he just bumped him back down to the band below what was appropriate. So there's really no hard, fast rules. You have to stick with it for certain types of things. The idea is just to generally restrict that variance, to focus more upon a game that's technical and tactical rather than being physically oriented, or a situation where you got just one kid who just takes over the entire game. So.
And you mentioned Amy's work down at Southampton, but from a psychological point of view, there's got to be huge benefits from both sides. Like you say, the encouragement of leadership for the late maturing guys, and the understanding of where they're at from the early maturing guys and girls, of course. Yeah.
So it's an interesting one because the psychology aspects of it were one of the sort of big criticisms we got when we first started looking at biobanding. A lot of sports psychologists jumped in it immediately saying, oh, this is inappropriate. You can't do this. Kids are going to be at different levels in terms of psychology. You need to look at that. And yeah, that's true. We do need to consider the psychology of it. And there was a lot of concern as well about having players play down and saying, okay, to this kid, this is going to create stigma for a kid. And in fact, I remember being at one of the FA Advanced Youth Award sessions, and it was actually, this has happened twice, and it's been coaches from exactly the same club each time. I won't name the club. But this club had a policy that they would not play players down. If you were good enough, you could play in your own age group, and that was that. And the argument was that asking a player to play down would create social stigma for the child, and it would be terrible. And the coaches for the club were sitting there going, this is absolutely bananas. He says, I understand, there's a benefit to the player going down, but my club won't let me do this. And the problem is we're losing some of our best players because of this. They're going off to other clubs and getting picked up by them. And it was one of the coaches from Tottenham who stuck up his hand at that point of time. And he says, look, two of the boys who've made it into our first team played down pretty much through most of their academy because that was what was right for them. He says, what you've got to do is to identify it as a particular pathway. And he said, if I was asking a kid to play down, I would name that player and say, oh, you're on the so-and-so pathway. He said, United could do the same thing. You're on the Jesse Lingard pathway. Jesse played down 2 age groups, I think, at some point, and he was still one of the smallest players at that point. Or you could say the Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain pathway and stuff. So almost identifying and recognising it as a successful pathway. Now, one of the things that's kind of happened since then as well in terms of kind of getting over this is to educate the players in terms of what you expect them to do when they play up and play down, and explain the purpose of it. If you explain the purpose, then people are more likely to take it on. One of the best stories I got back from a biobanding event was from John McEwen at Everton, and they had a boy who was a late developer, the most talented boy, he said, in the entire academy, and they asked him to play down with the wee boys, and he came back after a day and said, John, what the hell am I doing here? This is a challenge. And John says, look, you're looking at the wrong challenge. He says, yes, you're a tactically fantastic player, but you're not a leader, and for you to play for Everton, you need to be a leader. Go down and play with those younger boys, lead them, organise them, motivate them, communicate with them. That's what I'm looking to get you out of the session. As soon as the kid twigged that, then he was fantastic. He understood what it was that he was doing. And if you look at all the education research, looking at mixed age classrooms, for example, that is what the older kids do. They consolidate their learning through teaching and supporting and mentoring the younger ones. And it's not that you just say, okay, well, it's biobanding versus age group, one or the other. That late developer is still going to get those optimal challenges when they're playing in their age group. So it's not a case that all of a sudden you ask them to play down and their career's over because they're not getting challenged. The key thing is giving them a diversity of challenge.
Fascinating stuff. Well, I'm going to wrap up there, Sean, because I've taken just over an hour of your time. But it's been a pleasure to speak to you again 4 years down the line. I look back to see what date it was, and I couldn't believe it was 2017. Obviously, last year was a write-off, or last 18 months was a write-off, so it's been 2.5 years. But where can people find out more about your work? Where's the best place? Social media as well.
Yeah, so my social media, I've
You've got a Twitter account since last time.
I have joined Twitter. Yes, I was getting a lot of pressure, but I don't know. I've got a lot of good graduate students that I'm working with just now, and I felt it was probably a good idea to get their stuff out there and promote the work that they're doing, and to get onto Twitter as well. And I was also aware there was a lot of nonsense out there on Twitter about growth and maturation as well. A lot of folk talking about relative age effects and confusing it with maturity, and I was like, Christ, if we're going to get this bloody message across that relative age and maturity are not one and the same, I'm going to have to get out there and actually explain a lot of these concepts, because there's a lot of folk out there who still haven't got a clue about it. And so yeah, I felt that I should probably jump on. So I am on Twitter now. I think it's Sean_PhD. I'm not sure how it gave me that name. I just logged up and all of a sudden that was my name. So
Happy days.
I don't know if I change it, then people might not be able to find me. So if you look at Sean_PhD, you'll find me. But there's a lot of other good people on Twitter who do growth and maturity research as well. So definitely take a look at their work as well. I have a ResearchGate page as well. So ResearchGate is kind of like a Facebook for academics, where you can put up your latest papers, and you can put up posts, etc. And I put up a lot of the articles that have been written about our research, the videos, etc. that have been done, some of the animations as well, and the biobanding, they're all up there. I need to update that because I haven't updated that for about a year or so. But that's what moving on to Twitter does for you. So,
spend all your time fighting about growth and maturation.
Yeah, but even if you just Google, biobanding, things like that, you'll find lots of interesting articles out there, weighing up the pros and the cons of it, etc. But yeah, it's been fun. We're starting to get a lot more international uptake now. So we've got France looking at it, Germany looking at it, Switzerland. So it's going to be fun to start to see the research come out from other people looking at it as well.
Happy days. Well, thank you very much, Sean, and yeah, appreciate you coming on for a part 2 4 years down the line. But have a great day. Stick around. We'll have a little chat afterwards. But officially, I'll let you go.
That's lovely. Thanks again for the opportunity, Rob.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers, Sean.